The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the quiet of an empty room or a calm morning. This was something else entirely. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears. The kind that makes your body go still before your brain catches up. I was standing at the observation window of Orbital Station Meridian when every alarm on the station went dead at once. No beeping. No hum from the ventilation fans. Nothing. Just the soft, terrible sound of my own breathing. Then I saw them. They came out of the dark between Jupiter and the asteroid belt. And at first I thought it was a sensor glitch. Commander Alara Voss, that's me, 22 years in the United Earth Fleet, and I had never in my career seen a sensor reading that large. Lieutenant Owen Price was sitting at the navigation console 3M to my left, and I watched the color drain from his face the way water drains from a cracked glass. Slow at first, then all at once. "Commander," he said, just that one word, just my rank. He couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't need him to. I was already reading the same numbers he was. 4,211 ships. I had read the intelligence reports on the Vorkai. Everyone had. 18 months ago they had appeared at the edge of our solar system like a rumor, like something whispered in a dark hallway. They had not spoken to us. They had not tried to communicate. They had simply arrived at the colony on Kepler Station 7, and within 6 hours there was nothing left of it. Not the buildings, not the supply depots, not the people. The ground had been scraped flat as if the colony had never existed at all. We sent drones. The drones came back with footage that the UN Council spent 3 days arguing about before classifying it. I had seen the classified version. I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes at night. A flat gray plain where 14,000 people used to live, and at the center of it, a single child's shoe. After Kepler Station 7, there was Callisto Base, then the 3 farming settlements on Europa's southern shelf, then New Adelaide on Mars, which had a population of 60,000. Each time, the same result. Flat ground, silence. A few personal objects scattered at the edges, as if the Vorkai were careless in their work, the way you might drop a receipt after buying something you didn't particularly care about. We had tried hailing them 47 times across every known frequency. We had sent mathematical sequences, light pulse patterns, audio recordings, video messages in 60 languages. We had even tried a simple binary greeting that a graduate student from Nairobi had designed. Something elegant and clear that even a civilization with no knowledge of human language might understand as friendly. We received no response. Not a refusal, not interference. Simply nothing. As if our signals were insects buzzing against the hull of something enormous and indifferent. The word the analysts used was harvesting. The Vorkai were not conquering territory. They were not building an empire. They were moving through the solar system the way a farmer moves through a field, taking what they wanted, leaving what they didn't, and not giving a single thought to what the field might feel about it. That was the word that stayed with me. Harvesting. As if we were a crop. As if humanity, with all its cities and its music and its arguments and its history and its love, was something you could simply pick and carry away. I had a daughter. Her name was Nora. She was 9 years old, and she lived in Sydney with my mother. And 3 weeks before the Vorkai arrived above Earth, she had sent me a drawing of our family. She had drawn me in my uniform standing very straight with a big yellow star behind me. She had written at the bottom in her careful, slightly crooked letters, "My mom protects the stars." I had folded that drawing and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, right against my chest, where I could feel the edge of the paper when I breathed. I was feeling it now. Lieutenant Price finally found his voice. "Commander, they're not stopping. They cleared the Mars orbital corridor 12 minutes ago. Trajectory is direct. They're coming straight for us." "I know," I said. "All 4,000 of them." "I know, Owen." The station intercom crackled and Director Caleb Morton's voice came through from the command bridge. Morton was the senior UN liaison on Meridian, a tall, grey-haired man from Edinburgh, who had spent 30 years negotiating trade agreements between Earth's nation-states, and who, in my experience, was almost impossible to frighten. His voice was frightened now. "Commander Vass, we need you on the bridge immediately." I took one last look at the observation window. The Vorkai fleet was not yet visible to the naked eye, but I knew it was there the way you know a storm is coming before you can see it. You feel it in the pressure of the air. You feel it in the way the light changes. I turned and walked to the bridge. The UN Emergency Council was already assembled in a remote session on the main screen. 23 faces in a grid. People from every nation on Earth who had been pulled from their beds or their offices or wherever they had been when the alerts went out. They looked frightened. Some of them looked angry. One of them, a woman named Minister Priya Akafor from the Global Defense Committee, looked the way I felt. Completely calm on the outside and completely terrified on the inside. The vote was quick. 11 in favor, 1 abstention, no votes against because there was nothing to vote against. There was no other option on the table. The final message would be sent. It had been written 14 months ago by a small team that had worked in a basement facility in Geneva with no windows and no public record. I had been part of that team for 6 weeks before my posting to Meridian. The message was not a poem. It was not an appeal to mercy. It was not a speech. It was a list. A very clear, very precise, very carefully worded list of exactly what humanity had built in secret over the past 11 years, and exactly what we were prepared to do with it if the Vorkai did not stop. The council wanted me to read. Lens no bigger than my thumbnail pointed directly at my face. 4,000 ships were coming. The cities of Earth were going dark below me. Emergency protocols cutting the lights to reduce heat signatures. And from the observation windows on the port side of the bridge, I could see the coastlines of continents outlined only by the faint glow of emergency strips along the evacuation roads. I thought about Nora. I thought about her drawing. I thought about 14,000 people on Kepler Station 7 and 60,000 people on New Adelaide and every flat grey plane where something human used to be. Then I looked at the camera and I began to speak. This message is directed to the fleet now approaching Earth. My name is Commander Alara Voss of the United Earth Fleet. I'm speaking on behalf of every human being on this planet and in this solar system. You have not spoken to us. We have tried many times to speak to you. That time is over now. There is only one thing left to say and I am going to say it once clearly so that there is no misunderstanding between us. What follows is not a threat. It is a statement of fact. Please listen carefully. I paused. I breathed. I kept my eyes on the camera. Stand down or face annihilation. Then I kept reading. Every word of the list, every system, every weapon, every number. My voice did not shake. My hands folded in my lap below the camera's view were a different matter, but my voice did not shake. When I finished, I nodded to Patrick Adler and he cut the transmission. The bridge was absolutely silent. 72 seconds passed. I counted them. Then Lieutenant Price looked up from his console. His face had gone past frightened into something I didn't have a word for. "Commander," he said, "they're accelerating." I stood up from the broadcast chair. I straightened my jacket. I felt the edge of Nora's drawing against my chest. "Then we begin," I said. The message had taken 11 minutes and 40 seconds to deliver. I know because Patrick Adler told me afterward when it was over, when we were all still alive and still trying to understand how that was possible. 11 minutes and 40 seconds. The longest 11 minutes of my life, and I have had some long ones. But the Vorkai did not stop, and so what came next began. At 3:47 station time, I gave the order to activate the deadfall array. The array had been 11 years in the making. It had been built in the dark, piece by piece, funded through budget lines with names like Orbital Infrastructure Maintenance and Deep Space Research Support, and Satellite Replacement Program. 216 engineers had worked on it across 3 separate facilities, none of whom had access to the full design. Only 7 people on Earth knew exactly what the array was and how it worked. I was one of them. It worked by disrupting the quantum resonance field that Vorkai ships used for their propulsion system. We had figured that much out from the wreckage they left behind on Europa. Fragments of hull material that our scientists had analyzed for 9 months before one of them, a physicist from Oslo named Dr. Ingrid Hold, had an idea in the middle of the night and written it down on a napkin, and then sat very still in her kitchen for a long time before calling her supervisor. The array didn't fire a beam. It didn't launch a projectile. It simply sent a pulse, a very specific frequency pulse, and if the pulse hit a Vorkai propulsion core at the right angle, the core would fail catastrophically. I gave the order. Patrick Adler relayed it. 3 seconds later, the array fired. The first Vorkai carrier went dark before any of us on the bridge had fully exhaled. It was not dramatic, not from our distance. The ship simply stopped moving. Then 60 seconds later, it came apart quietly in slow pieces that spun off into the dark like seeds from a broken flower. There was no fire in space, no explosion, just a silent unfolding, a ship that had been solid becoming fragments, becoming debris, becoming nothing. Owen Price said, very quietly, 1. Then the array cycled and fired again. The second carrier went the same way. Then the third. Each one silent. Each one certain. The array had a charge cycle of 90 seconds, and we had 412 firing solutions pre-calculated and loaded. We had done the math 11 years ago in a basement in Geneva. We had planned for every angle of approach, every possible formation, every contingency we could imagine. What we had not planned for, what no one had planned for, was that the Vorkai would figure out what we were doing after the third ship. They were not slow, I will give them that. They were not slow at all. Within 4 minutes of the first array pulse, the Vorkai fleet began to shift formation. They spread out, widening the gaps between ships to reduce the chance of a single pulse hitting multiple propulsion cores. They also began, and this is the part that told me we were dealing with something that thought, something that adapted, they began rotating their ships continuously so that the propulsion cores were never presenting the same angle for more than a few seconds at a time. The array's accuracy dropped from near certain to roughly 60%. 60% against 4,000 ships was still a very large number of ships. But it was no longer the simple, clean equation we had hoped for. They're adapting, Owen said. Yes, I said, they are. I had always known this was possible. Dr. Holt had warned us about it in her original report. She had written, in her careful academic language, that any species capable of building the kind of ships the Vorkai used was almost certainly capable of identifying and responding to a technical threat within minutes of first exposure. She had recommended we not rely on the array as a primary weapon, but as a first strike, something to thin the fleet before we committed our other systems. We had listened to her. The deadfall array was never meant to win the fight alone. It was meant to begin it. I turned to Lieutenant Commander Fiona Blake, who was managing the weapons grid from the secondary console. Fiona was from Bristol, 34 years old, and she had the calmest hands of anyone I had ever worked with. Right now, those hands were moving across her console with a precision that I found genuinely reassuring. Fiona, I said, lunar mirrors target the forward column. Targeting, she said, ready in 40 seconds. Fire. There's nothing to hear. What you see, if you're watching from the right angle, is a shimmer on the moon's surface, like heat haze, and then a line of light so bright it leaves a mark on your vision even through the polarized observation filters. The forward column of the Vorkai fleet had 14 ships in tight formation, moving faster than the rest in what I recognized from our tactical models as a spearhead configuration. They were trying to punch through our orbital perimeter before we could respond. The mirror beam hit the lead ship and held there for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is a very long time when you are watching through polarized glass. The ship did not come apart the way the array's targets had. It did something different. It simply went bright and then brighter, and then there was a pulse of light that made every filter on every observation port on Meridian go fully opaque for 2 seconds, and when they cleared, the lead ship was gone. Not broken, not in fragments, gone. And the 3 ships immediately behind it were tumbling out of formation, their outer hulls warped and pitted, their propulsion systems damaged. "For confirmed," said Owen. He had stopped counting after the first 3 array hits. Now he was counting again. "Keep the mirrors on the forward column," I said. "Don't let them regroup." This was the moment, I think, when the Vorkai understood that what they had arrived at was not what they had expected. They had come to harvest. They had done this, according to the intelligence we had pieced together from signals and debris and the testimony of a single surviving drone from Callisto Base, approximately 41 times across 41 different star systems. 41 civilizations. Some of them had fought back in the way that an animal fights back when it is cornered, with courage and desperation and no real plan. The Vorkai had never encountered a plan. They encountered one now. The mass driver network activated at 4:12 station time, 9 minutes after the array's first shot. This was the third layer. 600 electromagnetic accelerators embedded in asteroids throughout the inner belt. Each one loaded with tungsten cylinders approximately the size and weight of a family car. Each one capable of launching its payload at 4% of the speed of light. The targeting system had been calculating firing solutions for the past 7 years. It knew exactly where the Vorkai fleet would be. The Vorkai didn't see it coming. Not because they weren't looking, but because tungsten cylinders traveling at 4% of light speed are extremely small and extremely fast. And by the time your sensors can confirm one, it has already arrived. The volley took 11 minutes to cross the distance from the belt to the fleet. 11 minutes during which I stood on the bridge of Meridian and watched the array fire and the mirrors burn and the forward Vorkai column slow and scatter. And I breathed slowly and steadily and thought about the drawing in my inside pocket and waited. At 4:23, the tungsten volley hit. The impact zone covered roughly 800 kilometers of Vorkuta formation. The cylinders didn't target specific ships. They didn't need to. At that density and that speed, the impact probability of any given cylinder hitting something was high enough that the mathematics became simple, brutal, clean. In 4 seconds, 214 Vorkuta ships were destroyed or critically damaged. The bridge erupted. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that everyone on the bridge made some kind of sound at once, a collective exhale that had been held since 347, a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite a cry, but something in between, something deeply human that I didn't have a word for. I didn't make the sound. I watched the numbers update on my screen. 3,744 Vorkuta ships remaining. Still more than enough to end everything on Earth's surface if they chose to commit to it. Still advancing, though the forward column was now in pieces. Still adapting. Fiona Blake looked up from her console. There was something in her expression that I hadn't seen there before, a kind of hard, bright hope that was more dangerous than despair, because despair sits still while hope keeps moving forward. "They're changing formation again," she said. "They're consolidating, pulling back the outer wings and compressing the center. Commander, they're forming a wedge." I knew what a wedge meant. It meant they were done maneuvering, done adapting to our weapons. It meant they had decided to simply drive forward through whatever we could throw at them and accept the losses and reach the surface. It meant they were still coming. How long until they reach low orbit? I asked. Owen checked his screen. At current acceleration, 4 hours, 18 minutes. 4 hours. I had 4 hours to decide whether what we had done was enough or whether we needed to use the final clause of the Roanoke Protocol. I sat down in the command chair. I folded my hands in my lap, the same way I had folded them during the broadcast, below the line where anyone could see them. Then I started thinking. The next 4 hours were the longest of my life. I have said that before about the 11 minutes of the broadcast, and I meant it when I said it. But 4 hours is a different kind of long. 11 minutes of standing still. For hours of moving constantly, adjusting, responding, watching the screens, listening to reports from Owen and Fiona and the 12 other officers on the bridge who were all doing their jobs with a focus and a steadiness that I will carry in my memory for the rest of my life. The array kept firing. Every 90 seconds, another pulse, another hit, another Vorkai ship failing silently in the dark. The rotation trick they had adopted reduced our accuracy, but we were still landing roughly 55 to 60% of shots, and the crews running the array from the ground facility in Iceland were not resting. They had brought in 3 additional targeting teams and were hand-calculating correction adjustments for the rotation patterns they observed in the Vorkai formation, feeding the updates into the array's targeting system in real time. I know this because Dr. Ingrid Holt herself was leading those teams. She had driven to the facility from Reykjavik at 3 o'clock in the morning when the alerts went out, and she had sat down at a terminal with a cup of coffee and started working, and she did not stop working for the next 31 hours. I didn't know that at the time. I found out afterward, but it matters in the telling of it because it is a very human thing to do, to drive through the dark to a facility in Iceland and sit down and Callisto suggested they might be damaged ships whose crews were attempting repairs. Lieutenant Dana Kellerman, who had a more pessimistic turn of mind, suggested they might be ships whose crews were already gone, drifting. Either way, they were no longer a spearhead. At 6:11, something new happened. A single Vorkuta ship, smaller than the carriers, approximately the size of one of our own frigate-class vessels, broke away from the main formation and moved toward Meridian directly. Not in a combat approach. It decelerated as it came closer, which is the opposite of what you do when you're attacking something. It came to a stop approximately 200 kilometers from our hull and simply held there. Owen Price stared at his screen for a long moment. "It's not targeting us," he said. "It's not charging weapons. It's just sitting there." "Is it broadcasting?" I asked. He checked. "Yes, on a frequency we haven't heard the Muse before," narrow beam pointed at us. I looked at Marcus Webb. Marcus had a background in xenolinguistics, which is the study of potential non-human communication systems, a field that had been largely theoretical until 18 months ago, and had since become very suddenly practical. "Can we decode it?" I asked. He was already working. "Give me a few minutes." I gave him 6. In those 6 minutes, the main Vorkai fleet continued its advance, and the array continued firing, and the mirror battery swept slowly across the formation, and 2 more Vorkai carriers went dark. But the small ship held its position 200 kilometers off our hull, broadcasting steadily, and I felt something I had not felt since this began. I felt curious. Marcus looked up. "I can't decode the content," he said. "Not yet, but the structure of the signal, it's organized. It's intentional. It's not random noise, and it's not a weapon frequency. Commander, I think they're trying to talk to us." The irony of this was not lost on me. 47 times we had tried to talk to them. 47 times they had said nothing. We fire 300 of their ships out of the sky, and suddenly they want a conversation. I did not say this out loud. It was not the right moment for observations of that kind. "Keep trying to decode it," I said. "And keep tracking that ship." At 7:14, the main Vorkai fleet crossed the low orbit threshold. They were close enough now that the ships were visible to telescopes on the surface. I know this because Fiona's husband, a secondary school teacher in Bristol named Alan, sent her a message at that moment saying he could see them from the back garden, and that he had never seen anything so large, and asking if she was all right. She showed me the message later, not during the battle. During the battle, she simply read it, typed back 3 words, and returned to her console. The 3 words were, "Doing my job." The Vorkai wedge hit our orbital perimeter at 7:31, and the second phase of the battle began. Our perimeter was a network of automated defense platforms, 312 of them arranged in a sphere around Earth at an altitude of roughly 400 kilometers. They were armed with conventional rail guns, and a newer directed energy system that one of the development engineers had named, with what I consider an inappropriate cheerfulness, the Sparkler. Each platform operated independently with its own targeting AI, which meant they could not be shut down by disabling a central command node, and they could not be deceived by jamming our communications, because they didn't need to be told what to do. They already knew. The Vorkai wedge hit the perimeter, and the platforms opened fire. What followed was the most intense 90 minutes of the battle. The Vorkai were pushing hard, accepting losses, trying to break through the perimeter line the way you might push through a thorn hedge, by simply committing to forward movement regardless of the scratches. They were losing ships. We were losing platforms. Platform 73 went dark in the first 10 minutes, then 41, then a cluster of 7 in the mid-southern quadrant where the Vorkai had identified a gap and hammered it. And then, one of the Vorkai beams found a path through the gap and hit the surface. I heard Owen Price say, "Impact," in a voice I did not recognize as his, and I looked at the geographic display, and I saw a marker in the Saharan region of North Africa where a beam had held for 12 seconds before the platform coverage closed the gap and blocked it. 12 seconds. I didn't have immediate casualty figures. The evacuation protocols had been active for hours and that region had been prioritized because of its low natural cover. I told myself that and I kept moving and I kept giving orders. The perimeter held. It held because of the platforms that were still active and because the array kept thinning the attacking fleet. And because Fiona Blake had spent the past 4 hours preparing the mirror batteries for a new targeting solution that she activated at 8:49 without asking for my authorization. Snorts, because she could see that I was occupied and she knew what needed to happen. 17 mirror arrays focused together. Not on individual ships but on the rear of the Vorkai wedge. On the engine sections. On the part of the fleet that was pushing from behind. The rear of the wedge came apart in 4 minutes. Without the pushing force from behind, the wedge stopped. It did not retreat. It simply stopped moving forward, and for 7 minutes the Vorkai fleet held still. 7 minutes of stillness while the array kept firing and the platforms kept shooting, and Marcus Webb sat at his linguistics console and worked, and I stood in the center of the bridge and breathed and waited and felt the edge of the drawing in my pocket. Then Owen said very quietly, "Commander, the outer wings are pulling back." I looked at the screen. He was right. A third of the fleet, the ships that had stayed back and watched while the wedge drove forward, were moving. Not toward us, away from us. Back toward the dark between Jupiter and the asteroid belt. A third of the fleet was leaving. I didn't let myself feel anything about that yet. What about the center? It's a repeated phrase, the same phrase over and over on that narrow beam pointed at us. He paused. It translates roughly to a question, the same question repeated. The translation isn't perfect, but the best approximation I can give you is this. He looked up at me again. It says, "What are you?" The bridge was quiet. Not a question about our species name. Not a request for coordinates or identification. Not a demand. A genuine question, the kind a person asks when they have encountered something they did not expect and do not understand. What are you? I looked at the observation window. The center of the Vorkai fleet was still holding. The retreating third was almost to the belt. The small ship was still broadcasting, patient and steady, 200 kilometers away. Then I looked at Fiona Blake. "Keep the Roanoke claws armed," I said, "but don't fire it yet." She nodded. I walked to the broadcast console and sat down in the chair again. The same chair I had sat in hours ago when I read the final message. I looked at the camera, the small black lens. My hands were in my lap. I nodded to Patrick Adler. He activated the transmitter, narrow beam, pointed at the small Vorkai ship. I looked at the camera and I said, "We are the people who live here, and we are not going to leave." Then I nodded to Patrick again, and he cut the transmission. For 60 seconds, nothing happened. Then the center of the Vorkai fleet, 3,000 ships that had been holding still, turned. Not in a weapons arc, a turn. A movement of the entire formation, slowly, like a turning tide away from Earth, away from the perimeter, away from us. Owen Price watched his screen for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "They're moving away." He checked again, then he said it properly. "Commander, they are retreating." I sat in the broadcast chair, and I did not say anything for a while. I breathed. I felt the paper in my pocket. I listened to the sounds the bridge made as the officers began to understand what had just happened. The battle was not over. The Vorkai center was moving slowly, and 300 of their ships were still in the vicinity of the perimeter. Some of them damaged and drifting. Some of them clearly capable of further action but choosing not to take it. There would be hours of monitoring ahead and days of assessment and weeks of repair. But the center was moving away. The small ship, 200 kilometers from our hull, received my transmission, processed it, and then turned and followed the fleet. It did not transmit again. It simply left. Ona looked at me from across the bridge. The hard, bright hope in her face had changed into something quieter and deeper. Something that had no name I knew of but that I recognized because I was feeling it myself. "Stand down the Roanoke clause," I said. "Standing down," she said. I sat in the chair for another minute. The screens were still full of data, still tracking, still processing. Owen was giving calm, steady updates. Marcus was archiving the Vorkai signal for later analysis. Patrick Adler was running diagnostics on the transmission systems with the focused efficiency of someone who needs to keep their hands busy. All around the planet, in the cities that were beginning to turn their lights back on, in the evacuation corridors where people were stopping and looking at each other and not quite believing what they were hearing on their emergency comms, in a back garden in Bristol where a secondary school teacher was watching the sky. And in Sydney where a 9-year-old girl was almost certainly awake far past her bedtime looking out a window at stars that were still there. The stars were still there. I stood up from the broadcast chair, straightened my jacket, and went to do the next thing that needed doing. There was a great deal of next things. There always is after something like this. Reports to file, damage assessments to review, personnel to account for, a surface impact site in North Africa to coordinate relief teams toward, platform repair schedules, array maintenance windows, 100 conversations I needed to have with 100 different people about what had just happened and what it meant and what we would do next. I did all of those things. I worked through them steadily, one at a time, the way you cross a difficult piece of ground. One step, then the next without looking too far ahead. It was 2 days later when the immediate response work had settled into a manageable pattern and Meridian's repair crews were out on the hull and the Vorkai fleet had cleared the outer edge of the solar system and continued moving and showed no signs of stopping or turning back that I had my first unscheduled hour. I used it to call Nora. She answered immediately, which meant she had been waiting by the comm unit, which meant my mother had let her stay up, which meant my mother understood that some rules are worth bending on certain occasions. Nora's face appeared on the screen, very serious, very focused. Her dark hair loose around her face because she had not bothered to brush it yet. "Mom," she said. "Hello, love," I said. She looked at me for a long moment with the particular intensity that 9-year-olds sometimes have, the one that seems to see everything. "Did you do it?" she asked. "We did it," I said. "We're all right." She nodded as if this had been the expected result all along and she had simply been waiting for the confirmation. "I kept the lights on," she said. "Grandma said to turn them off because of the protocol, but, snorts, I kept my bedside light on so you could see it." I could not have seen a bedside light in Sydney from Meridian. Nora knew this perfectly well. It didn't matter. "I saw it," I said. She smiled. It was her real smile, the one that looked exactly like her father's had, about that. About all the civilizations out in the dark, watching, listening, assessing whether the solar system at the third star cluster from wherever they were using as a reference point was a safe place to visit or a dangerous one. About how many of them might have their own plans, their own intentions, their own reasons for crossing the space between stars. They all heard Vorkai's message now. All of them knew what had happened here. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Good, I said. I meant it. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out Nora's drawing. It was creased now, folded and unfolded many times over the past weeks, and the yellow stars she had drawn behind my figure had softened at the edges from handling. But the words at the bottom were still clear, still in her careful, slightly crooked letters. I looked at them for a while. Then I folded the drawing carefully, put it back in my pocket, and went back to work. There was still a great deal to do. There always will be. That is the thing about humans that I think the Vorkai did not anticipate, the thing I believe no species that observed us from the outside ever fully understood until the moment it was too late for such understanding to be useful to them. We do not stop. We rest sometimes. We mourn often. We argue among ourselves and make mistakes and occasionally lose sight of what matters, but we do not stop. We never have. We look at the dark and we build something to push it back. And when that isn't enough, we build something more, and we keep building, not because we are certain we will succeed, but because the alternative is to stop building, and that is something we simply do not know how to do. The stars were still there. They would stay there. We would make sure of it.